We're live? All right. I'm going to play something. This is a substitute lecture for History 329 on Tuesday nights for those who watch the class but are not taking the class. An exam will be given at the time that this is offered. I'm going to place in front of you something now that represents three interpretations as to the origin of the term mafia. And various scholars adhere to one or the other. Of the three, I particularly prefer number two. The first one comes from an Arabic statement, and the second one, Mazzini authorizes theft, arson, and poisoning. Taking the first letter each, you end up with mafia. The other is related to a development which I will comment upon involving French influence in Sicily at an earlier time, and merely means death to all French is Italy's cry. So we will leave it at that. I prefer the one Mazzini authorizes theft, arson, and poisoning. Mazzini was an incendiary, a pamphleteer, a revolutionary in the 19th century, lived into the 1870s, and did his best to organize youth and others to unify Italy and throw off the yoke of any foreign influence. Also, he wanted to remove princes and dukes of any kind in any hierarchy of the church for a totally democratic and egalitarian society. I will now only comment on where the third one comes from so that you will understand why the death to all French, being they are Italians. So I'll leave it at that and remove that now and talk about that situation. In the late 11th century, one of the sons of Louis IX of France, who died in 1270, one of his sons, Charles of Anjou, a prince, French prince, gained by marriage and other arrangements, gained control, and as part of his patrimony and inheritance, part of southern Italy and the island of Sicily. And as a result, there were several thousand French troops on the island of Sicily, and about 3,000 of them in Palermo. And an incident occurred that often occurs when you have foreign troops in an area where they care little about, have no regard whatsoever for the local population. And incidents do develop, and there's frictions in one way or another because of the condescension on the part of the troops. And it seemed that there was an important wedding to occur at the cathedral that day, and some of the French troops, just having a little fun, decided they might break in the wife, or the future wife, the bride, the betrothed, before the wedding. So that was a very insulting incident, of course, and it violated one of the standard rules that even Machiavelli advised in his book, The Prince. Whatever you do when you want to have control, you can use all the power you want, but you must make those you control fear you. You must never do anything that will cause them to hate you. Because if they hate you, then they forget to be afraid, and then action will occur. That's exactly the case that happened in Sicily at that time. So as a result of that, the word went out, and there was quiet organization for a revenge, a vendetta of sorts because of this nasty incident. And at an appointed time, in the afternoon on a Sunday, when the bells would ring for Vespers service in late afternoon, there would be a general rising of the populace. And there's no way that 3,000 troops could hold off, even if they were essentially the only armed ones with firearms, or rather with swords and weapons of that type, could hold off the entire population of a city of tens of thousands, may have been 40 or 50,000 by that time. So the general rising occurred at the sound of the Vespers bell. And when that occurred, they slaughtered the French troops. If you were to look up this incident in an encyclopedia, you would look for Sicilian Vespers, and it is listed in Encyclopedia Britannica exactly under that title. Now, it is assumed then that death to the French, all the French, is Italy's cry. If you buy that, that's fine, but nobody really knew what Italy was at that time, and it wasn't a common word used in that fashion. We have to wait the Renaissance until you have somebody like Petrarch actually use the word Italia, and he has a feeling that it is different than what is Teutonic or French to the north of the Alps. But either way, those are the origin terms that are often used, I prefer the one involving Mazzini. You have to understand also that Sicily is an island here, and that it is a Mediterranean island that has been under influence of a variety of cultures throughout European history. And it is a part of the Mediterranean world. Therefore, Sicily, even today, the coffee is stronger, and somebody satisfied with Sicilian coffee isn't happy in Rome with the coffee there. It's never quite as it should be. Maybe it's not strong enough, or the way that it is made. Also, the various seafood dishes, other things influenced by Muslim cooking, the general Mediterranean culinary approaches to things, all are different with the spices and the sauces in Sicily than they might be generally in other places in Italy. So Sicily has a unique character, but it was, for a long time, overrun by outsiders, and that was the case in Roman times, after Roman times. And then it was also the case, it had been a Greek colony even before Roman times. Phoenicians were there from Carthage. And then after that, you had at least off and on a century and a half of Muslim control after the expansion of the Muslims across North Africa. So Italy was a segmented area, if we're talking about the peninsula. And when we use the word Italy at this time, all we can talk about is the peninsula as such. You have a variety of sovereignties in different locations. So Sicily is kind of unique and special, and for that reason it has also been a special problem to a unified Italy in modern times, in that it is an impoverished area and had been. The working class or the peasant class were usually abused and blood-sucked to a heavy degree. And in the 19th century, by the time you move to that time period after the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Sicily, as you can see here, is single color along with the area south of the Papal States ruled by the Pope, all the way down through Calabria and then here Sicily. And it formed a kingdom called the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, or it is more commonly called Naples, the Neapolitan kingdom, ruled by a branch of the Spanish Bourbon family, and that all has to do with intermarriage, patrimony, and a general European peace settlement in 1815. And of course, the aim is to control, stabilize after all the disruptions caused by Napoleon during that time period. Things didn't improve on the island, of course, and if we've moved through the 19th century, it is conspicuously obvious that Europe is changing. An industrial revolution has started in the 18th century in England. It eventually expanded to the continent. By the time we reach the 30s and 40s, rail is being built in France. It's being built even more in Germany, and Western Europe is changing and becoming more industrialized. And when that does touch Italy, it is going to affect the northern part much, much more. And that's a segmented Italy, which probably has only 12 to 15% who speak what you could call an Italian language at that time. All the rest are speaking dialects. And then the most advanced areas in the north, here, right, more people would speak French on an educated level quite often than any brand of Italian. And then when you move over to these two provinces of Italy here, you can see that those are under Austrian control, and they would remain under Austrian control until one in the 60s, and then the other brought in 1866. So Italy has this very unfortunate history, and its unification in 1870 means Italy is a younger nation as a nation state than the United States is, with our Constitution dating back to 1787. Either way, you cannot heal all the wounds that come with this, and furthermore, you can unify the peninsula, but what any Italian statesman would have said is they were attempting to do that in the 19th century. Maybe we can make Italy, but the biggest problem will be to make Italians. That is the most difficult thing that will be faced. Now, anytime you have a society in which the downtrodden are pressed continually and you are on borderline poverty continually, it leads to criminal activity again and again. And there was much of that in the island. So individuals who owned landed estates and other things might make certain they had individuals of a secret society in their pay for their control. So whether it's villages or cities or landed estates, you seek some sort of quasi-vigilante control, and that can happen in reverse too. of the peasant class having secret societies to protect themselves from abuse in one way or another. But when that happens, quite often, what you would call general law enforcement is carried out in a private way by those who are in the position of control, or use individuals who have the power to carry out a vendetta or enforce something in one way in a brutal fashion. So those types of secret societies and organizations, not unlike what we had in the American West, but most of those were quality citizens who realized law and order had broken down. They formed vigilante organizations. We're talking here about secret societies, and yes, with handshakes and other apparatus of symbolism, and that element was there. So uprisings, brutality, poverty, all those aspects were endemic in that island, and then Italy is unified in 1870. And so if you have individuals who live by their wits, or who have lived by extortion or payoffs in one way or another because of influence, and in southern Italy and in Sicily, always the position of the important individual, who we like to use the word Don for that, and we often have, maybe abuse it a large degree. That person in position, the important thing is not just wealth. You might be wealthy, but only by Sicilian limited standards. The important thing is the word in Italian, rispetto. Means you're the person who must okay certain developments. You're the person whose nod someone would want if you wanted your daughter to marry into this family. It's that kind of a position that counts for much more in southern Italian history than it is the case in northern Italian history, where actual wealth can carry more influence than it would in the South, where that much fluid wealth is not available. So to protect themselves, many times, individuals and groupings formed secret societies and groups, but also there was rivalries between one village or town than another. And this was particularly a problem in the area around Palermo, and a crucial area is just out from Palermo on the sea here, and it's in a gulf, and the gulf is called Castellamare. And that word will come up again because it becomes important around 1930 to 32 in New York, with the last big round of gang wars among Italians and how that is settled. So that's the situation that you have, and so criminality is endemic there. One thing I would like to say also, for individuals who, when Italy wasn't united and you considered you had an evil government, and hence the government is evil, and you can nod to those who resist evil government and its tax collection and other things, because the government provides nothing for you, it extracts. And when that is the case, you're not essentially an outlaw in terms of your fellow citizens if you resist the government and help them survive better against government exactions. That would be true also if you were looking at the Philippines in World War II under Japanese occupation. As a Filipino, you would not be considered a criminal or an outlaw if you blew up a train carrying Japanese supplies or operated in any way against those who were the outside controllers of your island. Once World War II ends and you have a legitimate Philippine government established, then for you to operate that way in criminal activities, carrying out murder, theft, extortion, and other things, now you in fact are a criminal, aren't you? Which means after 1870, individuals who engage in all those activities do not want to give up their livelihood, their organization. And so as we go into the 1890s and approach the 20th century, you still have individuals who have rispetto, who have agents. And so if you're the baker, you might have to pay off to make certain your bakery is secure. You might have to pay off in order to have a job working on this particular large estate. That arrangement might be there, just as you may have to pay off on the New York docks at a later time if you want a ship unloaded, or you want to make certain that the fish market is supplied by certain sources. So all of those things live on. They are criminal activities. We would call them racketeering of some kind today. But all that element is there. And then there's a tremendous immigration that occurs at the turn of the century, and it picks up in the 80s because this is a very impoverished area from Rome south, very, very impoverished. And if you were to look generally at the immigration figures from the 80s moving all the way up to World War I, and to determine how many Italians migrated to the United States during that time period, you would probably find out that maybe more than half, maybe as high as 68 to 70% came from Sicily. And then if you moved on from there, you might be able to go all the way up to 90 or 90% plus who came from the area south of Rome. So we're saying Naples, Calabria, Sicily. And though the Mafia is identified always with Sicily, there was an organization in Calabria that operated as well and moved farther north in modern times to have influence in Naples. It is called the Camorra. Now, with the tremendous immigration that came, the truth is that you had pockets of Italians living in major cities in the United States. And the area where the population would be the largest, of course, is New York. I'll give you one figure so you think about it. Probably at the turn of the century in 1900, if New York had, and I think it did, a population of around or just over 3 million. 3 million. I would say that no less than 500,000 of that population was Italian. And if we're giving the percentages, then you know the largest percentage is Sicilian. That fact is there. As a matter of fact, in the late 1880s, it's been pointed out by census arrangements that in New York, in the late 1880s, as you approach the 20th century, English is not the first language for more than 50% of the New York population. So we're talking about a wide variety of immigrants at that time too, from other areas in Europe, and you have them from Eastern Europe at that time. So these situations are there, and if you have that large of an Italian population on this side of the Atlantic, and you have ghettos like Little Italy, then the same practices of preying upon your fellow countrymen that occurred in the area of Palermo in Sicily and southern Italy are going to happen in the United States as well. Individuals are going to live by their wits and live off someone else if they can. And usually that's through some sort of extortion, however broad you want to make that word. Now, the first time in the United States, and we don't use the word mafia to mean an organization yet in the United States. We don't come to true, concrete, businesslike, solid national organization for what you would like to use the word mafia until we come to the early 30s and the work of Lucky Luciano. Earlier, though, you do have pockets of Italian gangs and organizations in a variety of places, and the two most common west of New York, this early, before the turn of the century, would be in New Orleans and in St. Louis. And I read about this years ago, and the Mafia is my hobby, and just happened to do this. I was passing through in the late 70s, St. Louis on a Greyhound bus, and there was a 2-hour layover before I had a bus to Chicago. Now, having come there from San Diego and having very close Italian friends in San Diego, most of whom were Sicilian, and some of them went to school with me, but I knew the adults in the family went there for dinner and other things. And I knew a family very well with a uniquely Sicilian name. I've never even seen the name in a Roman phone book or a Florentine phone book, let alone Genovese phone book. And the name is Tocco, T-O-C-C-O. So I decided during the 2-hour wait to go to the large collection of phone books they had there in the bus terminal in St. Louis. And I decided, I wonder just how many Italians there might be here in St. Louis. Well, there's no way I can find that out with this phone book, but I'll choose the name Tocco, of which I knew appeared in the San Diego directory 9 times. And first generation types would all have been fishermen like the Portuguese in San Diego, but there were some now are in other businesses. But there were 9 Tocco families at that time in San Diego. Looked at the St. Louis directory, and I could count 82 Toccos alone. And that's a Sicilian name. So you see the immigration and the impact in certain areas. Now, the first time there appeared to be a consciousness of Italian organization and gangs in the United States that reached the newspapers because of the violence that arose from it occurred in New Orleans in 1890. And many Italians had emigrated to Latin America and then moved north. Some emigrated directly to New Orleans. And many of them were not documented and did not enter legally. So New Orleans, you know, is a tremendous port. And for that reason, you could work on the docks, and if you wanted to organize, you could. And by the time we reached the late 1880s, there's rivalry between two gangs, I don't want to use the word gang, two family organizations who would like to control all the work on the dock. In other words, you pay off, they determine who works and who doesn't, arrangement. One was Matranga, and the other was Provenzano. There were three Matranga brothers, two Provenzano brothers, and they respectively led their organizations. So the rivalry between them caused death to occur continually on the docks in a vendetta fashion, tit for tat. And citizens of New Orleans were a little bit disturbed by this development, even though it was a time in which much that would make the city called the Big Easy were developing that early. But as we approach 1890, there was a mayor of New York named, of all things, his last name was Shakespeare. And he was very, very bigoted, and he even made public statements about the slovenly, lazy, lowest class of humans on earth, and that is Southern Italians and Sicilians. And he made that statement more than once. And he would like his city to be a little bit improved and better than that, and would like to have no more of those kind of people there. Then as the murders developed and violence occurred, a new police commissioner named Hennessy decided he was going to do something about it. And it didn't balance out right because it seemed like he picked on the Provenzanos more than the Matrangas, or vice versa. And so there was animosity between the two groups. Matrangas tried to buy him off, and he wouldn't go for it at all. And so Hennessy was declared an outlaw to them because they concluded that he was in the pay of the Provenzanos, and that's the reason they couldn't reach him, because after all, anybody arrested, they could always bribe the jury, bribe the judge, or intimidate in some way so that there weren't convictions. And that didn't go unnoticed by the non-criminal element of the civilian population of New Orleans. So in the midst of all of this, Hennessy, in a trial in which a couple of Provenzanos were going to be tried for murders of members of the Matranga family, Hennessy made a public statement that indicated that he was going to testify at the prosecution of the trial, and he would testify there and give evidence proving that there was an underground Mafia-type organization in New Orleans. And it was only a couple of days later, when he left his office and started home in the late afternoon, that he was lowered by a shotgun blast. There were about 60 witnesses, and individuals ran up to him. He was able to pull his own pistol and fire off a couple of shots at those that fled. And then his last words, as reported now in the papers and those who were witnesses, his last words before he slipped away were these words, "The Dagos did it," which is a derisive slur term as part of American history, and it's not one that is known to all, but those who have a long tradition in American history, especially those who grew up in cities that have neighborhoods that might be Slavic, Italian, Irish. They are conscious of those kinds of words. And it's not easy to all. My colleague, Professor Piero Baldini, who teaches with me here, and we teach together in Italy in the summertime. And Professor Baldini is a naturalized American citizen, but did not come here to teach until after he had his PhD. And he's professor of Italian, but his background as a youth growing up in early college is obviously in Florence, Italy. And he'd never spent time in the South, nor did he know the long traditions of Italian immigration and development in the United States. So one day I said to Professor Baldini, who's a long-standing friend, "Piero, did you hear about the Italian prostitute that never let a day go by?" Dead silence. He had no idea what I was talking about because he was not familiar with that term. Well, it's the term that Hennessy used in 1890 to describe those who were responsible for his death. 11 individuals were arrested in connection with that because there were plenty of witnesses, and they were prosecuted. But because we would think of money, influence, intimidation, whatever, of the 11, the jury could not reach a decision on 3, but 8 of them were acquitted, which of course aroused resentment among the general population in New Orleans. And after that verdict was handed down, and it appeared they were still incarcerated now, till everything could be completed and all of them released or part of them released. There was a large celebration in the Italian section of town. And it happened to be the birthday of Umberto I, King of Italy. But many of the population who were not Italian took it to mean it was a celebration commemorating, in the Italian section of town, commemorating the fact that these prisoners were able to beat the rap. They were able to go free. They weren't being punished for all the violence that was occurring in New Orleans. And so there were several meetings in different locations with speakers, and then finally a large throng of 3,000 or 4,000 descended upon the jail. And there were probably 60 leaders of that crowd who were very prominent citizens in New Orleans. And they broke into the jail area where the prisoners were being held, and then they took 3 out and hanged them from lampposts on the street. And then they proceeded to shoot others inside in their cells, and 2 others hid in the dog houses for the watchdogs that the prisons used, and they merely fired weapons through the dog houses. And so 11 individuals die, and these individuals are lynched, whether it's shooting them or hanging them from lampposts. This is a lynching. One of the ironic things about that lynching is there were plenty of black citizens in the crowd. So you have this ironic situation of non-blacks participating in the lynching, or blacks participating in the lynching of non-blacks in the South before we reach 1900 even. So there were many recriminations, but from the local press, the attitude was good riddance. That's the attitude. And a song was written by a local songwriter, which became very popular in New Orleans, called Hennessy Avenged. But it made the other press as well, and it soon came to the attention of the Italian government. And at the time, Benjamin Harrison was President of the United States. His Secretary of State was James G. Blaine of the state of Maine. And James G. Blaine had a nasty mess on his hands now when the Italian government broke diplomatic relations with the United States. So this was a serious situation, and finally an arrangement was made with the Italian government because 3 or 4 of the 11 were illegally in the United States, hence they were citizens of Italy. So we killed foreign citizens, didn't we? And so eventually a settlement was made for $25,000 to the families of those who died, who were Italian citizens. That being done then, diplomatic relations were restored. As we move closer then to the 20th century, some of the extortion practices are operating in New York, in Little Italy, in that area, and the police department in New York, until 1880, did not have a single Italian on the police force, let alone somebody who spoke Italian. And yet you have 500,000 people who are of Italian extraction, and maybe 75% of those converse in Italian all the time with each other. The predominant element in the police department was Irish, and some Jewish, and then others. And so in 1880, the mayor and police commissioner got together, and they took in Joe Petrosino. And he was trained, he was fully bilingual, knew many of the people in Little Italy, and he trained him. Within a few years, he was elevated to the level of detective. And he was a very effective police officer in tracking down members of a group called the Black Hand. And as he pointed out in his investigations, most of these individuals were freelancers who merely took advantage of that symbol of the Black Hand in passing out extortion notes. It wasn't really an organization. Many of them were in the United States illegally, but they were preying upon fellow citizens of one kind or another, indicating make this amount of money available to us, and all they had to do was put the black hand at the bottom of the extortion note. He had a very good record of catching individuals like this, deporting as many as he could who were in the United States illegal, but plenty of arrests, and the activities of the Black Hand fell off almost 60% in a 4 or 5 year period because of Joe Petrosino. Eventually, he was moved up to the level of lieutenant. That's the highest ranking police officer of Italian extraction, I think that early in American history. Finally, by 1909, the police commissioner decided that because of the illegals and because the Italian government seemed to be playing games with the American government, by doctoring the passports of any number of individuals they would like to unload from their prisons, and therefore would look as if they did not have prison records, and they could clear their prisons in many ways or decrease the population of their prisons by sending them in large numbers to the United States. And that would account for those that came in generally illegally on freighters, not passenger ships, but usually freighters, supply ships of one kind or another, plus those who had phony passports because they were really criminals from Italy, and that's where they were leaving because of possible prosecution there for activities or to protect themselves from vendettas of one kind or another. So it was decided that Joe Petrosino would be sent to Italy secretly to investigate the backgrounds of individuals who would be resident in New York but be in fact illegal, and that way he would have the information needed to deport many of these undesirables. And he went to Naples, and then he moved on south to Sicily. And unfortunately, in answering some newspaper questions, the commissioner of police did agree that he wasn't ill and at home, but Petrosino was actually in Italy. So it wasn't kept a secret. I don't know how they would have kept it a secret for somebody who was an American, even if he was fluent in Italian, moving on south and being in Sicily. There, he obviously would have discussed things and asked questions of the mayor in Palermo and a police commissioner in Palermo and others. And all these individuals could easily have plants and others on the payroll for that type of thing. So it was no secret whatsoever. And then one evening in 1909, after he'd had dinner, he went out to the Garibaldi Garden, which is in a piazza in Palermo, and I would assume paused for a cigar or something of that type. And he was shot 3 times and killed in Palermo. Tremendous funeral in New York. They estimate that maybe 1.5 million were in the streets at the time of the funeral. But either way, he is gone. Italian sources conclude that the man who did it was the local Don in Palermo, and the #1 Don in that end of the island, and that's the area where the Mafia operated. They didn't operate in Syracuse and Messina and other regions like that, but in the western end of the island, Palermo and Castellammare, that area there. And a fellow named Don Vito Casciofaro it was determined by authorities after investigation over the years that he was responsible for eliminating Joe Petrosino. So that brings a strong consciousness to the police in the United States about this situation. The police commissioner, by the way, was later fired because an investigation showed that he did not help keep the mission a secret by his comments to the press in the United States. Now we move on up then, with high immigration continuing, to the period of the outbreak of World War I, 1914 to 1918. And those who study organized crime in the United States, that's organized, not simple homicide or simple theft, but organized crime one way or another. And there were organized gangs, there were Irish gangs, there were Jewish gangs, there were Italian gangs at this time. And those who study it and look at the figures during this time period indicate that the impact of the war, the number of individuals who could work and would have jobs and not operate in another way, the number of individuals who may have served in the forces in one way or another, the amount of activity on the dock, the amount of security on the dock because of possible sabotage and explosions in munitions plants and other things, that there was a gradual decline in the activity and the work and the prosperity of organized crime in the United States. And looking at those figures during the war, it's a healthy sign for law enforcement by the time you reach 1918. However, in 1919, we have legislation passed which will outlaw alcoholic beverages in terms of production, sales, and consumption in the United States. That is a large boost and a large source because it is a law that runs contrary to the habits and customs of half or more of the population. That's one factor. And secondly, the reality that to enforce that law, you certainly have to violate a tremendous amount of privacy in order to enforce that law. You also open an area in which if it isn't enforced, it may be economically advantageous to people in the area of law enforcement and inspection, one way or another, to not enforce the law. So it creates an economic boon. And that gives you a very flamboyant time in American history, which I'm sure most Americans are familiar with because of the number of films, documentaries, and the names that become associated with that time period. Certainly Al Capone standing out in a name that is known by everybody. But when we talk about booze and when we talk about organized crime, particularly in Chicago, we are really not talking about the Mafia as we would understand it, but we are talking about simply organized crime, and yes, there are gangs, and there are rivalries. In northern Chicago, you have D and O'Banion, so that's Irish, and in southern Chicago, you have the Jenner brothers, who, it's a large family of about 5 or 6 brothers, all of whom will ultimately be killed in a violent fashion, but they're the types that work the tenements so that this mother of her family that only lives in 2 rooms in this tenement but has 5 children knows that if she keeps the cooker going all the time in her little 2-bedroom operation and produces her 3 or 4 gallons a week or 12 gallons a month, she will have some income, and of course that is picked up and distributed by the Jenner brothers. And this operation, it's no different than having something cooking all the time. If you were a Michigan farmer and it's the spring and the maple trees are effusing their sap, you tap the trees, large tubs are on the cook stove all the time, steam rolling out, and eventually, that's all you have to do, it's going to be reduced to a thick fluid that you call maple syrup. So something cooking all the time. Well, that was the way it was in some of the tenements, and that was the business of the Jenner brothers, and they never cooperated with Capone. Hence, we're on the outside in terms of control when Capone decided to expand. And Capone didn't come until he was in his early 20s, and he was hired to come there by an individual named Johnny Torrio, who himself had been recruited from New York to work for the main boss in prostitution and other activities named Jim Colissimo. And Colissimo was the #1 Don that would be replaced by Torrio after he was assassinated. And then eventually there was the life of Torrio was attempted when he married a younger woman and said, we're doing well, let's sit back and relax it. There was too much competition, too much money to be made, millions. And so after being wounded, Torrio decided to retire and spent most of his time in New York and some in Italy. And the man who moved in to take control of the large amount was Al Capone, who, when he had problems with city officials, could merely move into an area outside the city, arrange for the incorporation, and as a result, he's handpicking the mayor, the police, constable, and whoever else in some place like Cicero, which at the time wasn't a part of the city of New York, or Chicago. So you have the dynamism of the booze period and bootlegging, right? And in that, plenty of violence in one way or another, plenty of corruption, and it operates everywhere, whether it's Canada coming into Detroit and then being shipped across to Chicago or serving Detroit, or illegal ships unloading in harbors at Baltimore, New York, and other places. Either way, it continues to develop during this time period, and millions are made. And it's interesting to note that it was income tax evasion that was the crucial thing in the conviction of Capone. It was never murder, brutality, extortion, booze, or other things of that type. And then we come to the end of Prohibition, and some adjustments will have to be made as we reach the early 30s. And it will take effect by 33, and those adjustments will have to be made when you go off booze. But booze will still be important. So particularly with the gangs in New York and New Jersey, and I might point out that there was gang rivalry in Chicago in running booze, but there was never gang rivalry in New York when it came to making money if you were smart and you thought in terms of what your returns would be. You forgot about your old world connections. And it's the difference between one generation of Italians, even though they may have come when they're 6 years old, 7 years old, and maybe even illegally or questionably, like Joseph Costello, Vito Genovese. Either way, that generation who are interested in making money and they believe in cooperation. And so they are never in any way bigoted or have any animosity if you happen to be of Jewish extraction as opposed to Italian extraction. But that wasn't true of the old guard in the United States, and the younger ones called them Mustache Petes because they believed in the old world, they had their mustaches, and they carried their old world, meaning Sicilian, rivalries and animosities with them and fought each other in New York over animosities that dated back to family feuds and vendettas that are associated with the cities in the region of the Gulf of Castellamare. So for that reason, we emerge and move into the 30s with two dominant individuals in New York. The boss, who considered himself boss of bosses, his name is Joe Masseria. And it is under him that works people like Joseph Costello, Lucky Luciano, Bugsy Siegel, Meyer Lansky. Down the echelons, they're generally identified with that particular area. And then the rival to him, who wants to be the boss of bosses and carry out everything himself and truly dominate, but remember, he's old world, he's a mustache pate, is Marenzano. So in the gang war, which they call the Castellamarese Wars, and they're called that underground term, but it comes right from the origin of these individuals as leaders and rival bosses from old Sicily. And the young bucks really didn't appreciate that, and this rivalry was getting in the way of making money and being successful. And so that's the reason it was arranged by Lucky Luciano, not him personally participating, and individuals at a restaurant. Lucky went to the restroom, and individuals stepped in and assassinated Joe Masseria. Now you have one boss. Unfortunately, he was a mustache pate, and he also wanted to be numero uno, the number one man, the strongest of all kind. And so, for that reason, certain arrangements and understandings were made by the lieutenants underneath Marenzano, which had already been filled out by Luciano and others who were under Joe Masseria, that they wanted a change and they wanted a new organization that would be beneficial for their generation. And that's the reason. And also, all the evidence suggests that Marenzano is planning to eliminate the top lieutenants of the former boss Masseria, who had thrown in with him. But there's every reason to believe if another year had passed, Lucky Luciano would have been gone. And so Lucky Luciano acted appropriately in cooperation with lieutenants under Marenzano, moved forward, and whether they pulled triggers or used knives or not, I do believe present when they eliminated Marenzano so that he didn't eliminate Lucky Luciano. And by the way, I think it was Mad Dog Cole who had been hired to carry out the activities against Luciano and some of those associated with him. I do believe that Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel were probably on the spot and present when they eliminated Marenzano. Now it's time for a shift. You have a different generation. Even if some of them were born in Italy, they came when they were young. And many of them knew each other from childhood. Lucky Luciano, Bugsy Siegel, Meyer Lansky, Joseph Costello, all big names in the New York family system, all grew up together, all engaged in theft and a little bit of narcotics and illegal activities of one kind or another together. And matter of fact, Meyer Lansky was a skinny little kid, and some of the others would beat him up for money when he went to school each day. And the point is, no matter how much they beat him, he would fight back and not give them a dime. And so as a result, they became friends, commiserated with each other, and now started carrying out what you would call criminal activity together as youths. And so as we move forward, there's no animosity there. You don't have to be a Sicilian, not with this new generation. The generation is to be successful, to be organized, to have some organization that will mean you don't waste efforts in fighting each other. And that's the reason why in the 30s, there's a place for a man named Louis Lepke. There's a place for somebody named Frankie Yale. There's a place for Arthur Fliegenheimer that you know as Dutch Schultz. There's a place for Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Meyer Lansky's aide as we move all the way up, approaching the 40s, a fellow named Doc Staton, who was an accountant and a statistician. And Meyer Lansky, his abilities was always the banker, financier, advisor, consultant for the activity of organized crime. He doesn't have to take oaths, say, I want to become one of you. That element is not there. So it's Lucky Luciano who emerges as what you would call boss of bosses, and he never claims that title whatsoever. But he does establish a commission of the families in New York. He invites individuals from other cities like Detroit and Cleveland and Chicago to join with him in sharing information, and some sort of organization is worked out in which they will not violate each other's territory. And if a problem needs to be solved in Detroit, the Detroit people can do it, and tit for tat in New York, so that you don't violate each other's territory and you don't start gang wars and you don't complicate your ability to succeed and be prosperous in your criminal activities in an organized fashion. So we reach that point then with Lucky Luciano. And Lucky Luciano was in narcotics to some degree, but largely prostitution and gambling in New York and the numbers rackets. Joseph Costello, one of his associates, was almost 100% gambling, but Joseph Costello also was the one who was the chief contact and manipulator and political fixer with regard to judges, politicians, and things of that type. Right. And Bugsy Siegel cooperating with them, but a little more of a heavy, and I would say Bugsy had probably participated in more hits than others at this time. But either way, you have a good organization now, and there's plenty of sharing. And New Jersey, it cooperates in all of this. The man who had been the number one there for some time was Longy Zwilman. Doesn't sound very Italian, does it? But this is live and let live, cooperate. So the cooperation is there. And also important in New Jersey as well as New York is a fellow named Willie Moretti, whose alias was Willie Moore. But he would become one of the 5 Dons in the future. But he cooperated with Longy Zwilman in New Jersey. And by the way, it wasn't uncommon for mafiosi to have aliases. One of the individuals who became one of the top 10 in New York up until, maybe almost 1950 was a fellow named Joe Adonis. And that was his alias because he said he was so handsome he was an Adonis. So he chose that name. His real name was Giuseppe Dotto. He chose that name. Al Capone's alias was Joe Brown because Al Capone said he was very proud to be an American. As you see the words in the film The Godfather, America has been good to me. America has made my fortune. Al Capone felt that way, sent money to his mother all the time, and would allow no one to call him Alfonso or Capone. Al Capone. It had to be fully Americanized because he was an American and proud of it. That's the reason his alias, when he used it, was Joe Brown, which he considered one of the most common of American names you could use. So you have Luciano in this key, chairman of the board, but not boss of bosses, really not the big boss, and he doesn't ask to be boss of bosses. That isn't the point. The point is to cooperate, regulate, organize, and make money. That is the answer. And certainly Meyer Lansky, his financial advisor and old boyhood friend, would see eye to eye to him on that, as would the others. So you have, excuse me, maybe a 2-year to 3-year period there in which the organization functions with what you would say from a management point of view, a good record. And also, you do not want in any way to have gang killings unnecessarily because that draws attention to the underworld. And you also don't kill policemen. You pay off, organize, work with mayors, work with political machines, judges, and others. So Lucky Luciano was on the right track if you want to make money and become big. And there would be a time when Meyer Lansky would utter this statement in terms of the national organization and how much money they made. And he once made the statement, he says, you know what? We're bigger than General Motors. And he was talking about the collected incomes that were being made nationwide through Mafia activity. There would be expansions from New York, and Joseph Costello always had interests somewhere in the Midwest in gambling, some in Florida, and always in New Orleans, connected with a family that emerges there under the name Marcello. Hope they don't hear this. Right. So I always had gambling interests there because it was easier to buy your way in for gambling activities in the state of Louisiana. Even when Huey Long was there, it was possible, and it became more lucrative as time went on. Now, things might have been rosy in the operation of all of this, but certain things got into the way, and you did have to have gangland killings from time to time. And one of the best examples of that probably would be Dutch Schultz, Arthur Fliegenheimer, because he was a hot blood, a real, genuine hoodlum who didn't have the kind of soul that many of the Italians had. And when he became angry, he was angry. And we're talking about a time period in which Dutch Schultz probably could put in his pocket, at the peak of his career, $7,000 a day. And we're talking in the Depression. But he could do that. But he was a toughie, and he thought nothing of rubbing out anyone that got in his way or insulted him in any way. He was self-important, great attention to himself, so no affront would he tolerate in any fashion whatsoever. One of the reasons he changed his name was because he liked newspaper notoriety, and therefore Dutch Schultz would be an easier name to put in a headline, and he liked notoriety. He liked to be recognized when he went into the nightclubs, wanted everybody to see him. Hi, I'm Dutch. Which is not what Lucky Luciano wanted at all. Only in his younger days, when he had money, was there any flash in terms of automobiles and clothing. By the time you move into this period, Lucky Luciano is 100% business. So is Lansky, so is Joseph Costello. You live in the right places, the same place bankers and stockbrokers live. You wear expensive suits just like the kind that they would select in the same stores they would select them. Always, that's the image. No flamboyance and flair after about 1933, 1934. But the problem is that eventually Lucky would run into problems with Attorney General, State's Attorney Thomas E. Dewey, who ultimately would become governor of the state of New York. And when he ran into those kinds of problems, they had to do something about it because he was trying to crack down on the rackets of all kinds, and particularly prostitution. And when that disruption occurred, the anger developed in Dutch Schultz, and Dutch Schultz simply at a commission meeting said, I'm going to hit the SOB. And Lucky and the others said, no, you can't do that. He's a state attorney. He's an investigator. He has state visibility. We cannot have headlines. You don't do that. We can't do that. And he insisted he was going to do it anyway. And as soon as individuals reported back to Lucky Luciano and others that Dutch Schultz had stakes out, and they are observing Dewey's patterns when he left the house in the morning, where he paused to call his wife from a drugstore and other things like that. And when the stakeouts were there, sent by Dutch Schultz, Lucky Luciano agreed they had to move. So that's the reason that Dutch Schultz was rubbed out, because we can't have somebody that big in politics and in the legal system assassinated. Dewey was successful in prosecuting Lucky Luciano, and the main charge was organized prostitution and running brothels, and responsible for what you could say white slavery, anything, number of things you wanted. But narcotics was involved in that. And the chief witness against Lucky was one of his madams, who was a severe narcotics addict. And then many of the girls that testified, I think as many as a dozen, testified one way or another, but they weren't testifying to the inside knowledge and payoffs and other things and accumulation and management of it like the madam was. But the girls were involved in narcotics too, and so promises could be made by the government as to how they might reward them. But the madam was really strung out when the trial occurred. And I read two biographies of Lucky Luciano and read in detail about his trial. And in looking at the details, I would have to conclude that if that trial had been carried out 1955 or any time after that, there's no way you could have convicted Lucky Luciano, because there's no way a defense lawyer could not make use of the fact that the witness is a narcotics addict who is strung out, looking for a fix, nervous, and in a state where she will do anything that is promised to her. And that's what certainly was being promised by maybe some of Dewey's people. I don't know. But Dewey's an honest man. He's sincere, straightforward, and honest. Contrary to the role they gave him in a popular movie that came out 2 or 3 years ago called Hoodlums, in which a wonderful role by Dutch Roth plays a Dutch Schultz, just superb. But the idea of making Dewey somebody on the take, it just doesn't fit. That's not Dewey at all, and that was never true, and there's no way to document or even hint. Nobody would even investigate that. Nobody would doubt Dewey's honesty in all of this. So Lucky is prosecuted and successfully convicted, and they gave him a particularly high sentence, a large sentence, 30 years. Very, very stringent. So he is off to prison, although he does manipulate and has some control in management of operations after he has left. But still, the organization is there, and it continues to function in that fashion. We move up then to the World War II period, and it isn't as easy to operate in the World War II period, except with regard to union, construction, and contracts that you might control in all those businesses, because the amount of government money being spent on construction and production and other activities, supplies of one kind or another. But we move into the World War II period, and before, just into World War II, one of the top lieutenants underneath Lucky Luciano and others, I've mentioned his name before, and he'll become, for a short time, boss of bosses, or think he is, in the 50s, and his name is Vito Genovese. And because there are witnesses that could convict him personally of murder, he has to flee the country, and he flees to Italy. And he spends about 3 or 4 years in Italy during the war, and yet he is well protected and does very, very well in Italy because he has contacts for narcotics. And it turns out that Count Ciano, who is the Secretary of State or Foreign Minister for Benito Mussolini, also Mussolini's son-in-law, it helps to be the son-in-law, Ciano had a narcotics habit. And so Genovese took care of that for him and ingratiated himself with Mussolini's family. So it works out very convenient during the time that Genovese stays in Italy this time. Also, another favor is carried out. Carmine Galante, who's not even a lieutenant but farther down, is one of the troops at this time during World War II. And he is given a contract from higher ups because the communication comes from Mussolini, that Mussolini particularly hates and detests an Italian journalist who fled Italy so he did not have to live under or go to jail under the fascist regime there. And so he fled to New York, but he had a newspaper that was published, and all the Italians, many of the Italians read that newspaper, and it was printed in both languages. His name was Tresca, T-R-E-S-C-A. And he detested Mussolini and considered him a corrupt individual as well as a dictator and a brute. So Mussolini was continually being maligned in the press in New York. And as a favor to Mussolini, Genovese arranged, put the contract out in New York. It was passed on down to an individual who later would become almost one of the bosses by the 50s, Carmine Galante. And Carmine Galante carried out the hit on the publisher and editor Tresca. So there was cooperation and communication back and forth during that time. After the war was over, a development that occurred during the war, and I have read as much as I can read about this, but there are plenty of documents that are still secured and are not available. But the best I can tell you from all I've read in biographies, research on Lucky Luciano, what he did during the war from prison and other things, is that a subaltern or somebody who worked for the number 2 man under the Secretary of Navy. And there was a considerable problem with submarines, the damage the submarines could do on the Atlantic coast, as well as sabotage and other activities in ports. And it was determined, I don't know if it's the Secretary of Navy who determined or his chief advisor, but under him someone else whose name I don't know, but there had to be someone like that, who cooperated and realized that one of the wise things to do to control sabotage and other activities and make certain there were goods flowing in and out and those goods were secured, and no games were played by spies and others on the docks, would be to take Lucky Luciano into their confidence and arrange for him to help control the docks. Now, obviously, Lucky could have supplies and he could send gifts to families and friends that he knew. What do you need and what do you want? Because all of that could be supplied and covered up. Those are the kind of funds that could come out of the government that you would cover up and you would never know how to track those down. But either way, they made it comfortable for Lucky, and Lucky made it comfortable for the Department of the Navy and for security on the Atlantic coast. That favor was done. When the war was over, someone in the government, but it would have started in the Navy Department and then moved to another element of the government, right? They wanted to arrange for a reward for Lucky in one way or another, and it was thought that maybe they could release him from prison if he agreed to deportation. In order to work that out, though, he's imprisoned in New York. The man who imprisoned him in New York was governor of New York. And now they're going to have to rescind something done by Dewey. And Dewey, as you know, would become a candidate for president of the United States. And certainly Dewey wouldn't want it to look like Lucky Luciano was freed immediately after the war because of a payoff of some kind to give him campaign funds because he's running for president of the United States. So Dewey, because we are talking about secret Navy documents and World War II strategy here, very secret, Dewey cannot comment on anything about what went on in World War II. So all the innuendos can be thrown out there, and he has to cooperate with the government, at least he did, in agreeing to the release of Lucky Luciano and his deportation. Very unfortunate for Thomas E. Dewey. He had to be quiet about that for years and years, maybe 15, 20 years, before evidence could come out about those kinds of details. It wouldn't have been known at that time. So Luciano then is deported, and there's a large party on the ship that's going to take him home, and many of the mobsters are there, champagne being poured, and Lucky goes to Italy. And he will remain in Italy forever, except for the trips that he makes to a place called Havana. And under Battista's regime there, the mafiosi, with Meyer Lansky, Costello, and others, developed casinos and a very healthy amount of gambling there. And Battista benefited from that, but he certainly made concessions to make it easy. But after being spotted a couple of times in Havana at meetings in which other top underworld members from the United States were in Havana, the United States government brought pressure on Battista. And so Lucky Luciano knew, and he was not permitted any longer to journey that close to the United States because of the meetings with the other individuals there. By the time we reach the early 50s also, Joe Adonis has been deported because if you can't prosecute him for any particular crimes, you can prosecute him for lying about his nation of origin and lying on the papers that he filled out when he came in as an immigrant. And so he was deported, and he will live a millionaire's retired life in the city of Milan the rest of his life. Lucky Luciano, most of the time he spends in the South, some in Sicily, but largely in Naples. By the way, Al Capone is not from Sicily. Al Capone is Napolitani and Calabrese, but Napolitani, and Frank Costello is not Sicilian. He is Calabrese as well. But they all cooperated with each other very, very well, which takes us up into the 50s then. And it seems that the two individuals who could have pointed a figure at our friend Vito Genovese could have done that. They mysteriously turned up dead, one of them while in jail. And now Vito Genovese can come back to the United States. And it's then that you're going to start having some troubles in New York, because Vito Genovese would like to be boss of bosses. And so he returned. I was reading about this regularly in the 50s when I was in high school, and I subscribed to a magazine that went out of print after only 2 years, but it came out 4 times a year, and it was called U.S. Crime. And there were articles in there by J. Edgar Hoover and prominent people like that. And that's how I found out from day to day the arrangements being made when Genovese came back. And at the time of an investigation was carried out and nothing was found, Genovese lived in a home, let's say in 1951, 52, in New Jersey in the hills that was valued at that time at $30,000. You see, nice home, but modest. Modest in terms of big wealth, no splash. And he wore expensive suits, dressed conservatively, and he also had a job for which he was paid. And he made $208 a week as a supervisor on a longshoreman's pier. Although you know he wasn't doing any supervising, but he had a legitimate income to declare all those arrangements. So that's when you move into the time of troubles in which you're going to have the death of Joseph Profaci and the death of Albert Anastasia. And in the acts that are attributed to, let me put it properly, Joseph Bonanno, who would have been one of the youngest dons that New York had ever seen, but he wanted to move up and he wanted to spread out. And for that reason, he made a lot of enemies, and that's the reason ultimately he would be called before the commission where he wouldn't report. Ultimately, even his own cousin would be involved in his capture and incarceration as a prisoner. That would be Magadino of Buffalo, and that was by marriage a cousin of his. And then later, Joe Bonanno would be freed, and he would agree to go into retirement. But let's just leave it there in the 50s until we move at that point. There was an attempt on the life of Joseph Costello, merely grazed his head by the Chin Gigante, carried that out. And Costello never took actions against him, but shortly after that time, Costello retired. It's also in the 50s that you had the famous Kefauver crime investigations. And that's when many of these individuals were seen on television coming into the chambers of the Senate and then leaving the chambers of the Senate, and many were called. As a matter of fact, they even considered calling Frank Sinatra at one time, but they didn't really realize that it would do much good in terms of there was nothing more than a passing relationship that they could put a finger on in any way, even though investigators in Naples looking in Lucky Luciano's home while he was away in a clandestine search found a nice cigarette case that said, best of luck, your friend Frank Sinatra. No, it said, best of luck, Lucky, your friend Frank Sinatra. But we'll talk about that business in a little bit. But as we moved into the 50s, those investigations were carried out. Many individuals were called. One of them that was called was Willie Moretti. We'll mention him in connection with Frank Sinatra, right? And Frank Costello would have been the biggest stars that would have been called at that time. Costello insisted that his face not be put on the camera or he wouldn't come. He would just defy them and not come. If you want to put him in jail, go ahead and do that. And so that's the reason his famous hands are always there, and you see the camera on. When he is testifying, you can see him walking in and out of the courtroom in a hallway coming into the court, or the Senate hearings, not court, the Senate hearings, in that fashion. But that is all. And it's also in those hearings that Willie Moretti revealed clearly to the mob, or at least to enough members of the mob that something had to be done about it, that he was suffering from something like Alzheimer's, but he was losing his mind in some way. It could have been caused by syphilis, like the problem with Al Capone. I don't know. I've never read any evidence on that. But he was much too glib, much too open about talking about activities and associations of his earlier life, and the mob did not like that. Furthermore, he even said to the Senate panel when they excused him and thought he was being very candid, and they told him, "My, you are very refreshingly candid." He got up and he says, "Hey, if you're down in Jersey, come on down to the house. You're all welcome, you know." And he's inviting them to his house for a dinner, champagne, whatever, this type of thing. It's also at those hearings that they call Virginia Hill, who was one of the mob dolls, and who, when she was testifying at that time, we'll run into her again. But when she was testifying at that time, it was quite obvious that she was a very well-kept woman and that she always could pass out $100 bills anytime she wanted and lived in the best of style, the best accounts at the best clothing shops and all of this. And she's the one who had the home in which Bugsy Siegel was killed, and she was one of Bugsy's girlfriends, but she had been the girlfriend of maybe 5 or 10 names you would recognize in Mafia history in Chicago and other places. And she was asked by Senator Toby of New Hampshire, And imagine the throng sitting out there. She's in the witness chair. And this very staid, he was the most moral and ethical person on the Senate investigating committee. Certainly wouldn't be Estes. I've read a lot about Estes Giffard. And he leaned forward and he asked her what seemed to be a rather naive question. Could you tell us why it is that this money that comes to you, if you don't essentially earn it, but you live so well, and you consider these and you've described them as gifts, why is it so many important individuals are willing to be so generous to you? And I'll clean up the language because she didn't use these words when she said it. I'll clean up the language, but she said, frankly, straight out to the question of Senator Toby of New Hampshire, that's because I am the best goddamn lay in the world, which left him throat locked. Nobody knew what to do. And she didn't say it as clean as I put it. And so that's what, but she was there for that reason because they were searching every place they could search. And obviously she had the close associations with the Mafia. Now, let's wind up here with some aspects connected with what has given great notoriety in the last 20, 25 years to the Mafia, and that is not only things coming out like Fratiani's book, The Last Mafiosi, Joe Bonanna's book, Honor Thy Father, as well as, obviously, the writings of Mario Puzo and the Godfather films. And those were, the first two were blockbusters. And so, tremendous notoriety connected with this, and to a degree, there is some romance involved in all of that activity. Now, what Mario Puzo did, and I never was able to talk with him, I would love to have talked with him. He once was interviewed when The Godfather first came out, before it was made into a movie, just a book that was a bestseller. That asked him, why did he know so much about the Mafia? And he said he didn't know anything about the Mafia. This is all fiction. He put all this together as fiction. Well, what he has done is he knew a lot about mafiosi, and he knew a lot about the practices of mafiosi. He grew up and lived in the tenements of New York and observed all of those kinds of activities, rubbed shoulders with uncles or the individual across the street who chose at the age of 17, 18 to go with the gangs, to be a driver, other things, and move into the business. He was aware of all these kinds of things. And so what he did when he wrote the novel, he obviously took aspects of a variety of mafia dons and then added them to the character of Don Vito Corleone. So Don Vito is a composite figure. Some aspects of him are none of the dons, and some aspects are of different dons, or activities and actions by the Corleone family appear to be just that family, but it's not just that family. And that's the reason that it's handled in that way. And so if you look then at the Godfather approach that you have and what is portrayed there, there are some items that you have to understand. When you have the film, you have to understand that in truth, the olive oil business was the main business of Don Vito Corleone. The main business, the main olive oil importer, distributor, supplier in New York was one of the dons in the 50s who was killed, named Joseph Profassi. And as a don, he was considered the most tight-fisted of all, the greediest of all, a millionaire, and he wasn't the kind of individuals that would help his underlings become millionaires. And as a result, there were plenty of individuals that would like to see Profassi gone. All those working under him, people with names like Joey Gallo, and individuals of that type, because you couldn't carry out any operation without him bleeding you for large amounts, and he had to carry out no operations. It's just because he's the Don. And so nobody was sorry to see him go. By the way, the Mafia Don who probably made the largest number of millionaires for individuals working in connection or under him was Joseph Costello. He was never greedy in that way. He was generous in his tips, even to bums on the sidewalk, to the waiters where he ate dinner, to everybody. He was extremely generous, and he was also generous to those who worked under him. But Joseph Costello wasn't into the narcotics and prostitution. It was largely gambling. But either way, very, very generous. So probably a dozen individuals under him became millionaires. That wouldn't have been true with Profassi. But the olive oil business That was Profassi, and you see that in Don Vito Corleone. That is his large, legitimate business that he has at that time. Then in the Godfather book or the film, you have the situation of the Italian singer who is not doing as well, and he needs help from his godfather. So now they've made Don Vito Corleone the godfather of Johnny Fontane, who individuals immediately think of as Frank Sinatra. Now, about that business. All the underworld knew, and this was passed on to law enforcement people, so they all knew, that there was a nice career of Frank Sinatra, which was being stymied to some degree because he was under the control of Tommy Dorsey by contract. And he was making a fantastic amount of money. $125 a week before World War II is great money, you see. That's great money at that time period or just after. It's great money. I'd say if it's 1946, a Safeway manager would be making $28.50. Frank Sinatra's making $125. And that's contract after he came out with the hit All or Nothing at All, Tommy Dorsey. Right? He has his contract. His early rise came because certain spots were arranged for him in a variety of casinos and clubs, some of them legitimate, some not, by Willie Moretti, who worked with Longy Zwillman in controlling operations in New Jersey. So Willie Moretti is the Don that would have been the godfather to Johnny Fontane, not Don Vito Corleone. And I have read the telegram, which the police have, and I've seen it printed in 4 or 5 different places. And when Frank Sinatra was dallying with Ava Gardner, and he had been married in New Jersey, Willie Moretti knew the family. And so when Sinatra's picture appears in the paper with Ava Gardner and the other things, a telegram is sent by Willie Moretti commenting on how lovely his wife is and what a wonderful family he has. And he says, I'm sure you will be very happy with your family. The best of luck. That's Willie Moretti's way of saying, take care of your family. Remember, you're a married man, you have children. Now, you notice there's a scene in The Godfather, right, in which Sonny, who is having intimate relations with one of the bridesmaids upstairs when his father, Don Vito Corleone, wants him. He is sent for. Then he walks into the room late while the Don is talking to the undertaker, right? And, no, excuse me, he's talking to Johnny Fontane. And he's asked Johnny Fontane various questions. And then his son, Santino, walks in. Don Vito Corleone is a wise man. He's one of those Sicilians who is extremely wise without formal education. He understands everything. And when that son walks in, he looks at his son, looks back at Johnny Fontane, pulls him close, puts his hands on his cheek and says, do you spend time with your family? Sure, Godfather, sure. All right. Very good. Looks over at his son, looks back at Johnny Fontane and says these words, because a man who doesn't spend time with his family will never be a real man. The basis for that is that telegram that Willie Moretti sent. So it's a different Don involved, but that composite is part of it there. It is true also that Sinatra was released from the Tommy Dorsey contract, and the underworld's word on that. It was a gun pointed in the mouth of Tommy Dorsey with the instructions, sign, release the contract for $1, not $1,000 as you saw it in The Godfather. But those elements are there and hinted at. There, by the way, are no horses with their heads severed, but obviously pressure is brought in some way, but that is not as easy to document as other things where you have telegrams sent and other things that become public notice in one way or another, or documents that the police have in their protection or possession. Now, with regard to the judges and politicians, that's another attribute of Don Vito Corleone. As you know, in the later meetings, you're the ones with the judges and the politicians in your pocket, then you won't share them, right? The man who had the politicians and the judges in his pocket was Joseph Costello, that Don. And that was his big strength and his importance as a Don in New York. He could cover those things. But then, it is also true, Joseph Costello did not make his millions in narcotics. did he? And that is an aspect to be considered, and that is an aspect considered in the book and in the film, The Godfather, as well. Then this whole business about investing out west in Las Vegas. True, Bugsy Siegel would be the individual to front all of that. And he would go out to California, but he didn't go to Las Vegas. He went to California because the Mafia organization was very weak in Los Angeles. And you had an independent hood named Mickey Cohen. And then you had the Dragna brothers. Jack I. Dragna was the papa, and later his son moved up. But they didn't have a solid operation there. And Bugsy kind of fell in love with the Hollywood world in one way or another. And that is obviously where he takes up with Virginia Hill. And it's in her home that he ultimately will be shot. But he does go and observe in Las Vegas and realize that gambling can be very, very big there. And that's the reason he needs the funds to bankroll the building of the first legitimate resort casino hotel that was ever built in Las Vegas, the Flamingo. And he estimated $2 million. Now, the big money is going to be fronted by Meyer Lansky, and the individual who eventually go to Las Vegas after Bugsy's death to manage things will be a fellow named Doc Stacker. And so it's Costello money, there we got the Don, and Meyer Lansky money, because Meyer Lansky is in effect the financier of everything. And so that arrangement is made, and they commence to build. I read about this as it was being built when it reached the 2 million mark, and then it went over. And I read in magazines that report on crime that it had gone as far as 4 million before they completed the Flamingo. Well, the truth is money was being siphoned off, just as you siphon off money in construction contracts and in other ways. Bugsy was siphoning off money, and it did go on a cost overrun, but the overrun would have been there anyway, but not as large if money hadn't been siphoned off. And there was a meeting in Havana, and Lucky Luciano was there at that time, so was Meyer Lansky. They were consulted, and it appears they both agreed they have to do something about Bugsy skimming the money. Furthermore, his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, had been taking a lot of trips to Switzerland, and so it was concluded she was the bag lady. Later, that was proved because she actually went to Switzerland, picked up money, and gave much of it back to the mob afterwards. So she conformed in all of that. But that's the reason the decision was made to hit Bugsy, because of the skimming. The Flamingo lost money its first year, and from that time on, it was gravy continually. So Bugsy was right all along, even though Bugsy is no longer around. So he will be hit in her home. I can't think of anything else that involves Don Vito Corleone in that sense in the movie that can be quickly likened to the mob. But either way, that's the element that was there in those developments. Costello continued to have, until he retired, and I don't know, he probably still had them, plenty of interest. I would imagine then the other thing that receives attention again and again, and that involves a book that just came out in Arizona by a chap named Mahoney, the son of a very prominent citizen in Arizona, who I know, his father. And in that, Mahoney documents a gift of about $600,000 that was delivered by the Chicago mob under Giancana. That mob to offices in New York that would be used in Kennedy campaigns. And he has offered that. But that's a book about the Kennedy brothers and the relationship with their father. That is not about mob activities in Chicago, but obviously there were close connections there. And one other item I will comment on, because he received so much attention in all of the Untouchables series, is Frank Nitti and how he actually died. And in the movie that they did, you have him flying off a building onto the top of a car. That is untrue. Frank Nitti was a part of the Chicago mob. He had been a boxer, then he became a fence for stolen goods at the Capone's time, then a driver for Capone, and very much a part of the Capone mob. And he prospers all through the 30s, as does Anthony Accardo, who's known as Batters, and Frschetti, and then eventually a younger generation, Giancana, who's a little more volatile and draws too much attention to the mob. And so during that time period, as you move up to the 40s, the mob had decided they could move in on the movie industry and start getting kickbacks from the large distributors like MGM and Lowe's and Paramount and others, so that they couldn't really film and distribute without kickbacks automatically. So they're siphoning off in an extortion way. And the government put together evidence to all of that, and several of them were prosecuted and given light sentences, but then another prosecution of extortion of that type occurred, and a plea bargain was arranged, and the mob in Chicago had to give up one man, definitely, for appearance one way or another, in the plea bargain, would have to go to jail. And the mob, as a group, decided, Frank, that's you, Frank Nitti. And Nitti had spent time in stir before, and he realized he could not go back to jail. He just couldn't help it. But if he didn't cooperate, might have trouble with the mob, wouldn't he? And so Frank Nitti died while walking along railway tracks in a desolate area of the tracks in Chicago. And the witnesses observed that he was walking along with an overcoat, stumbling a little bit as if he were drunk, and then reached in his pocket, pulled out a gun, and shot himself in the head. And that's the explanation for the loss of Frank Nitti. Well, we have gone on an hour and a half now, so I think that's about as far as we're going to go. So thank you very much for listening.